Tell us about the scope of biodiversity in South Africa. Define for us bioprospecting, and then tell us what opportunities exist for pharmaceuticals in this country.
Yeah. Look, biodiversity is the term that covers all living organisms, be it animals, plants, or microorganisms, soil organisms, everything that is biologically active and alive. That's really the term biodiversity. Bioprospecting endeavors to make use of biodiversity in various ways, be it in making medicines from plants, using them as food, or using them as raw materials for biogas production. That whole scope is of biodiversity and bioprospecting is very large. South Africa itself is a very biodiverse, rich country. We have, in terms of plant species, more than 20,000 different plant species in this country, which is in a relatively small geographical area, a very large number. So that's very encouraging. It also opens the doors, of course, for many ideas of looking for active ingredients for many ailments of humankind.
Let's talk about the legal and regulatory framework that governs bioprospecting, because there have been a few controversies, and only this month in October the first license was issued to a pharmaceutical to partner with a local community to produce treatment for a variety of stress ailments, for instance.
Yeah. The challenges there are great. We have, in South Africa, we've got since 2004 a piece of legislation called the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act. Regulations to that have been written and published in 2008, and since then the industry, and any industry, I must say, that deals with plants and plant derivatives in any form, be it liquor, food, pharmaceuticals, fiber, etc., needs to actually apply for a bioprospecting permit. That is done by making a formal application to the Department of Environmental Affairs, and as it is a very new piece of legislation, not only in South Africa but also internationally. I think South Africa is one of the very few countries who have implemented biodiversity legislation over the last couple of years. It is a daunting task to implement, both from a government and a legislative process, but also from industry who have to apply and comply with it.
What are those challenges, those daunting elements? Because for this one company, it's taken them 8 years to get to this point where they issued a license.
Yeah, I mean, we as a company, also together with an overseas company called Schwabe, we have also applied for a bioprospecting permit some 2 years ago, and we're still waiting for the minister to issue the license. So that is a process of great due diligence that is being carried out, and a number of T's have to be crossed and I's to be dotted. So it's usually a very long process.
Cumbersome and bureaucratic. You mentioned Schwabe, and let's just talk a little bit about them by way of creating an example of the challenges that exist in the industry. They're looking at systems of extraction in the Eastern Cape. What does that program entail, and how are they working with local communities?
Yeah, we have, as Schwabe's representative here in South Africa, we are doing all the local work for them, and obviously with their backing and with them. We have been engaging with communities for a number of years now. Most notably, just recently we have signed a second access and benefit sharing agreement with the King Sandile Development Trust in the Eastern Cape. We've got a second, or the first actually, was also with a local community in the Eastern Cape, a benefit sharing agreement, whereby we as Parseval and Schwabe commit ourselves to engage with the communities in various ways. But it's the spirit of bioprospecting doesn't stop there. It's not a matter of going into a community and dishing out a check or so. It's actually a very deep involvement. It's a human involvement. One has to get to know each other. One has to gain each other's trust. It's not a simple, straightforward business relationship.
Let's talk about social responsibility in that case, because Schwabe, in the beginning of the year, faced a huge stumbling block when the local community effectively argued that they were patenting an indigenous system of production without giving back to the community, without a system of royalties, etc. I don't know how that case has been resolved since then, but these are some of the issues that the government also has to be concerned about, because ultimately you're commercializing a product internationally, but relying on local knowledge and local input.
This kind of discussion is always wrought with controversy because it's a new topic and it's open to a lot of misunderstandings and also misrepresentations.
Okay.
It's the very community, for instance, in the Eastern Cape that we have our benefit sharing agreements with, where this small community that lodged a complaint at the European Patent Office falls under. So we are actually dealing and having a benefit sharing agreement with the overarching traditional structure in the Eastern Cape. Nevertheless, this community chose to walk to the European Patent Office. Interesting fact is, though, that the European Patent Office withdrew the patent that Schwabe held on the extraction method, but not on the base of the complaints from the community, but on the base of the complaints from 3 competitors on technical grounds. In fact, what happened is that all the claims of the local community, and they were backed up by an NGO, were actually not accepted by the European Patent Office. So it's an interesting playing ground where one finds oneself in, and it's not easy to negotiate through that because it's also a very new field. It's we've seen the case of Hoodia, where over the past couple of years a lot of misconcepts have happened, and with the best of intentions, where one licensed that ours into international companies, and it actually backfired to the people who actually started the process.
Frank, let's just get your input here. South Africa's ranked 3rd in terms of biodiversity and natural endowments, but we're told that when it comes to regulation, they haven't performed really, really well. And they're talking about the Rio Convention, the fact that extension is voluntary, that South Africa is trying to legislate what effectively is an open-ended system of international standards, and that's where it becomes very complicated.
And I think that's the crux of this conversation at the moment. Although we have a regulation, a body of legislation, regulation around this whole bioprospecting efforts, the implementation of that legislation is where the trickiness comes in. Because although you know the well-meaning of the legislation and what it's supposed to do for the communities and wherever, we were luckily exposed, because we have such high bioprospecting taking place in South Africa, to some of these issues up front, the Hoodia issue and the Schwabe case that has just been.
But what it does raise is 2 issues. An environmental issue, which is to protect the environment from depleting these local and indigenous plants for commercial extraction. And secondly, it's rewarding the local community and years of knowledge and extraction practices through royalties. What this first license has done with the company that I referred to that got the license in October of this year is that they're being forced to pay royalties to the local community. It seems to be something that hasn't really existed.
No, and I think that's, one can see this broadly in three ways. Pre the Rio Agreement or Convention, this phase where we're trying to work out the legislation and what the growth prospects will look once the legislation is in place and sorted out. And exactly as you're saying, we're trying to acknowledge, or the legislation is trying to acknowledge, that there's a role to play here also for the indigenous communities that may have been using these things for many more years. And if the rest of the world wants access to them, there must be some type of agreement. And I think, as Uli has pointed out, this is not merely a sort of cash for goods agreement. There's and I think that's where the legislation is more. There's much more room for cooperative agreement, job creation, that type of
Let's talk about this issue of job creation, working more extensively with local communities. It's believed that within a few years, 20% to 50% of the revenues of most pharmaceuticals will come from these genetic resources, is what they call them scientifically. And the pharmaceutical industry is globally worth about $650 billion. So that's big money we're talking about. In terms of the royalties that accrue to local communities, or jobs, or the factories that you set up for big economies of scale, how do you go about it so that in the end we see the benefit of this partnership?
Yeah. I think it's what Frank is saying is quite right. There's just not one simple way of approaching this. The Act, the NEMBA Act, also does allow and provide for various ways of engaging with the nation as a whole, one can say. The benefits that can be shared are of monetary and non-monetary value. In our case, for instance, we do directly involve ourselves in communities, make cultivation projects. We're looking for projects also for future joint ventures with communities, but at the same time we're cooperating with the CSIR, for instance, on a research project, which is worth quite a lot of money in the sense of data and scientific knowledge being shared from our from the German company Schwabe with the CSIR. Skills are created, capacity is built, which can lead to future and more developments. And I think that's where we have to look at the potential role that bioprospecting can play in uplifting communities on a local level, obviously, but also to us as a country as a whole. Altogether, pelargonium is not just a matter of exporting the raw material. We also have a sizable local industry that is using pelargonium worth several million rands, depending on which level you look at it, on a manufacturing level or a retail level. So there are already quite a few things happening that are where directly South African biodiversity is wringing out money at the till.